Hello, welcome to Design Disruption. In many ways, we are at a crossroads for our future. Um, and we should not play down the magnitude of the moment we are in. We may be in midst of a global health crisis, but it's already having economic and social impacts. And just as coronavirus respects no boundaries or borders, neither do climate risk or socioeconomic challenges. This is a time of reinvention. This moment of crisis can serve as a great reminder to invest in resilience, equity, and well being. And in the Design Disruption series, we are keen to highlight this agenda for a better built environment and urban spaces. We are so thrilled to partner with Arc Daily, our media partner, on this important conversation on our collective future. I am Pratima Manohar, and I co-host this series with my colleague Sam Lubell. Sam?
Thanks, Pratima. And we're really, really excited. Again, yeah, Sam and Pratima, we're the hosts, as I think some of you have been on before know. I'm an architecture journalist and an author, and Pratima is also a journalist, and she runs a think do tank in India. So we are really thrilled to have two amazing architects, urban designers on with us. They are really kind of masters of this topic. The topic is architecture in the public realm. So public architecture, public space. And these are things that are really, really important to us and important to everybody. As we've been locked in quarantine, we're realizing just how much we value public space and how much we value the connection between our buildings and our public space. Benedetta Tagliabue is the co-founder of Barcelona-based EMBT. And EMBT have worked on major projects with incredible public connections like the Scottish Parliament at Edinburgh, the Diagonal Mar Park, and Santa Caterina Market in Barcelona. And Benedetta, your office you mentioned is right near the Santa Caterina Market.
Yes.
And the Spanish Pavilion at the 2010 Shanghai World Expo, and so many more. And Vishaan, besides being an important urban thinker and dean at Berkeley now, is also leading with his firm POW, is leading incredibly important projects like the Philadelphia's, where I'm from, Schuylkill Yards, Brooklyn's Domino sugar refinery, Detroit's Michigan Central Station, and so many more important projects. So we're really excited to have both of you on. Vishaan, I think your mic's on mute, so make sure you turn it off so you can.
I have some construction noise. Sorry.
So we were really thrilled to have you both on, and we want to talk about how you guys see the future of public buildings and public space. For the first segment, we call Blueprint, and essentially what we do is you guys can share your feelings using some of your projects, some other projects, however you want to do it, on the future of public space and where you think, because of COVID and because of so many disruptive factors, public buildings are heading. So with that, we're going to start. Benedetta, I think I'd like to ask you to go first and give me 1 second as I pull up your slides. So Pratima, you can keep everybody occupied while I'm doing that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I just want to take a moment to say hello to the community from Arc Daily and the bigger community of the urban, planning and urbanism community who joins us during these live casts. And we have, already I can see people from Argentina and Guatemala who's joined us. That's amazing. This is such an important moment to reflect. And I wanted to quickly ask you, Benedetta, what were you doing during this lockdown? I have a picture that you shared with me.
Yes.
During quarantine.
During quarantine, it's incredible. At the beginning of quarantine, it was also kind of cold, and but I was very lucky to have a piece of garden with this open air, and we discover how important it is to have a place to go outside and look at the sky.
What about you, Vishaan? How have you been during quarantine and lockdown? I know you moved.
We moved cross country from New York to California during this, so we've not had a quiet lockdown. But I agree with Benedetta. Now I'm in a place where I can easily get out into nature, which I couldn't as easily in New York. So this is nice.
Amazing.
So I see that Sam has pulled up the slides. So
I was going to say that the importance of what we're talking about now is how buildings interact with public space and how people interact with public space. It's so much more important now, especially for people that live in cities that don't have their own yards or own little spaces. It's essential. It's not just for fun. It's something that makes our civic life work. It makes us stay healthy and sane. So this is a huge topic.
It's really huge. When finally the park was open in Barcelona after more than 1 month of being inside home, I cried because I understood really how important it is to have a space where you can go out and meet people, and the city is part of you. So it's really very, very important.
Wow.
So, and I think in a way it's important to be involved. You know, the Santa Caterina market is a transformation of the complete area, and it's. I always say that it was a very egoistic project because we live there. This is our market, and we transform it, knowing that the transformation will include us. So in a way, I think to be involved in what you do, it's so important. And if this is not happening, then you have to think as if what you're doing is for yourself, because only including and the people taking the decision being included in the result, this gives the guarantee that you try to do your best. So I think this Santa Caterina, if you go on, is you will see a little more of Santa Caterina, and it's a very biographic project. We live next to it, and our son and daughters are called under the name of the Santa Caterina Monastery and the name of the monks who were Dominicans. So Caterina and Domenic, they are our son and daughter, and I think this is really representing that we are doing public works, trying to include ourselves as much as possible. So I think this is one of the topic, no? How to include. And if we go on, maybe we can see some other images. We have 2 images from the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish Parliament was a project, a competition. We won making a kind of a language mistake. We are from Spain and from Italy. And we participated to the competition saying the Scottish Parliament is a mental place, thinking that this mental place would be a place for the mind to give a symbol, but we didn't know that it meant a place for mad people. So anyway, maybe because Scottish people have a lot of humor, we won it. And I think the landscape is the first gesture. So you see here in front of the photograph, this place was not even belonging to the area, but we pretended to have it because it was representing symbolically the possibility for people to meet, which is the first act of assembling and deciding. So this kind of a landscape assembly is what keeps all the parliament on top of it. Without that symbol, this would not exist. So I think this is also one of the topics, no? And so the outside symbol of this landscape being like an amphitheater is the one which makes this inside space become important, which is the symbol we wanted to explain. No? This outside being the strength for the inside. So this you can see. Now we are very near the Queen Holyrood Palace. The Queen actually gave the land to make the possibility for the outside amphitheater to happen. So if we go on, maybe we can see an image of the Spain Pavilion. It's an expo. It was an expo in China. It was difficult to be natural, being including of the outside space, but we tried our best. The building itself was like a forest in a way. It was built with natural material, and we wanted this inside space to become like a forest. So I like very much to integrate the outside and the inside. I think this is very important. So also the architecture shouldn't be so different, let's say. No, not a landscape designers and architect. Maybe we can be one profession which makes a better place.
Right.
And I don't know if we have more images. This is also when you make towers, make big cities, it is so difficult not to make a tower being standing alone. So it's because it's really kind of natural, no, for a tower to separate herself from the rest. So we do our best to integrate the towers and the outside, and also very different level of the outside, and also maybe sky gardens, because this is very important, even if you have a tower, to have a collective place, a place where you can meet with the others. And this is the most difficult part, no? When you do it in a city and when you do it with towers, but it's worthwhile trying. It's really very, very important. And I think if in this image we see a very difficult place in France. It's in the outskirts. And there is a fantastic new project which is trying to include the outskirts, which have a feeling that they don't belong. You know, this is Paris, but they say, no, we're not Paris, we're something else. I think it's very important to have connections, and also very important to be respectful. You know? So this great subway station circles, which is going on now in the outskirts of Paris. This is only one station, but the station, it tries to be very, very, very inclusive, tries to resemble to the people, tries to be accepted. And this is so difficult, no, to be accepted. I think this is one of the great themes we have. And I think the blueprint, maybe, I don't know if you have some more images, maybe soon we'll be finished. This image is also trying to transform a city as difficult as Naples in Italy, always like through a subway station, and transforming like accepting in the same time, no? Not destroying everything, but make what exists become a part of it. And this is so important in Europe. You know, we have so many things already existing. So integrating them and transforming them and make them become maybe from a very wrong point of view to a fantastic one. This is a wonderful, wonderful task we have for the future.
That's wonderful, Benedetta. It's very inspiring. And just the way that you're thinking, that you want to, collaborate with others, that you want to make every space you can become civic rather than, something that's on its own. It's a gesture that I think we all need to appreciate more and more. And it's not just an empty gesture. It's not just something pretty, but it's something that is vital for our health, for our society, for everything.
Yeah, for our health.
Yes, mental, physical health, yes. So, Vishaan, I'm going to pull up your stuff, so give me 1 second.
Sure.
And we have a comment from El Fatom, who says it's great to see architectural form becoming more democratic, less elitist, following the great tradition of the public square. And I think that's the theme of public architecture, and the relationship between the built environment and the city. So thank you, Benedetta, for sharing those ideals for how we should define the future agenda and the relationship between the city and
it's so true. I love Santa Caterina, and and it isn't elitist. It is what, you know, it's this beautiful place, but it's so clear that like everyday people use that market. And I think it's one of the great public spaces in Europe, if not the world.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence you two are on this, because we think that you're two of the best people that we know of for sort of creating that sort of linkage. And Vishaan, we have some stuff of yours. Yeah. Maybe you can share some of your secrets.
Well, you know, they're not very secret. They're all on our website. But, you know, so, you know, I have done a lot of different things. I trained in both architecture and urbanism, and worked on the High Line and many other things like after 9/11, and started my own architecture firm 4 years ago. And this first diagram is really about many of the things that I learned coming into the beginning of the firm, which is basically how all cities, especially with technology, are changing from that hub and spoke city to what I call the kind of lattice city, where there's many more places where people work and play and recreate and live. And I think that's a very positive change, because it allows for this transformation where you can imagine, like in the next slide, that in any one of those nodes, you know, the Mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, talks about the 15-minute city. We've been talking about the 20-minute walk, where you can get most of what you need in your daily life within a 20-minute walk, but then you can still enjoy the rest of the city if you want to go, you know, to the opera or to the park or to the waterfront, that there's that possibility of having that village life as well as that larger metropolitan life. And so a lot of our projects are about trying to build that kind of duality between the village and the metropolis, and doing it with a sense of, you know, always three principles: sustainability, equity, and access. Meaning that one, you know, sustainability is obvious, equity, a big topic I'm sure we'll talk about today, and accessibility, meaning that, you know, can everyone equally access it as well? So I think we have a couple of projects here that speak to that. So right after that diagram, well, you know, one of the things that our firm did early on and continues to do is, in addition to client-based work, we just do social advocacy work. And we've got a very good relationship actually with the New York Times. And at the very early part of our project, of our studio, we launched this whole exercise with the New York Times to re-envision Penn Station. And they put it on the front page, and they just recently did it with something else that's at the end of these slides. But Penn Station is the busiest transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere, and yet it's a total embarrassment. It's completely unsafe, and it's indicative of the way in which we've stopped investing in infrastructure in our major cities, and especially public infrastructure. So it was great to have an advocacy project where you didn't have a client, you could actually think for the public instead.
Wow.
And then let's see, this is a project in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, which is the coldest capital in the world. And it's actually a lovely city, beautiful light, but there's very few places to walk. So our client asked us to create this small village right in the heart of the city. And this is under construction right now. And what's wonderful about it is it's all 3 or 4 stories. It's small shops and apartment buildings above. And it was very important to use local construction techniques and local colors to be of the place. And that's always very important to us. So rather than doing all glass buildings in a place where the climate is really averse to that, these have much more thermal mass and form this kind of atmosphere and this network of public spaces that we worked on with Jamie Carpenter and Bureau Happold. And so there's always that emphasis in the public realm. This is Domino. And just like Benedetta was saying, the relationship between inside and out. So this project's under construction as well. Domino Park is open. That's 6.5 acres of new public space on the waterfront in Brooklyn. And this is an example of sort of inserting the new into the old. You see the original parquet sketch that I had done over on the upper right compared to the current section, which is inserting this glass barrel vault with this enormous sense of public transparency down through the base of the building. And this had to go through heritage review and all of that. And it's actually been an interesting, fun process. And then this is a 100% social housing project in East New York, which is one of the poorest parts of New York City. Our client is actually a pastor, and it includes 2,000 units of social housing, as well as, that's a performing arts center you can see off in the distance, and a shared street, and this idea of different scales. And the local community was very interested in the use of brick. And so most of these buildings will be brick, actually, except for some of the foreground buildings, which includes a public school and the Performing Arts Center.
I love it. I love these.
And then lastly, this was just another social advocacy project where, with the New York Times, we created a project called NYC, or Not Your Car. And what it was a provocation to imagine what New York could be like if we eliminated private vehicles. And so the idea is you could still have areas for drop-off, protected bike lanes, raised mid-block sidewalks for people in wheelchairs or small children or people using canes. But the idea that if we had more street equity in the city, that you could have a much more equitable city. And we're hoping that that idea can make it into the mayoral debate and so forth. So what we just showed you is a small sample of just a combination of design and kind of provocation and troublemaking.
Vishaan, it seems like with COVID and people and the city starting to open up streets for restaurants and for pedestrians, maybe it's a little bit more viable. Maybe it's a silver lining. Well,
yeah, that's the reason, that article just came out, and we're trying to argue that we can't go back to the congested cities. New Delhi and New York have blue sky in front of them, on top of them, which we haven't seen. So that post-COVID moment, have suddenly everyone driving because they're afraid of mass transit. So we need to open up more space for transit and more space for public use.
Right, and one thing that struck me with both of your work is the fact that I think when we think of civic space and public space, we think of maybe a grand civic building with a plaza. But this idea that any type of building can and probably should be a civic space. And it's just rethinking how you think about buildings, really.
And especially the ground floor, yes.
I think it was Richard Rogers who once said that architecture is about public space held by buildings. And I think both your ideas and future agenda for public architecture and public realm seems to outline that. And, my first question to both of you is that, public architecture, which is owned by the commons, is about identity, it's about civic life, it's about public realm and public life. The importance of our public life has already been, in a way, hurt by digitization, polarization, and inequality. And it's been further amplified by this pandemic. And at this moment of great reflection, what should be the future agenda for architecture that incorporates or works with public space? And can you point out your own work to highlight this point and how you weave the public life and public space in all your architecture? Benedetta?
In a way, I don't know. I remember when we designed a project, which was a university in the north of Spain, in Vigo, and they came to us and they had a budget, and all the budget was given to the buildings. And we came back and we said, we need a budget which is comparable for the outside space. They couldn't understand it, They said, well, we have a budget for doing streets. This is not enough. It's really having something in your mind. All the institutions should have something in their mind that whenever you do a building, whenever you do an operation, a part of it should be dedicated to the public space, to the outside space. And this needs care, this needs budget, this needs money, and it's so important. It will be the quality of the building themselves. So this is maybe a possible agenda.
Vishaan, how do you integrate architecture and civic life together?
Well, I think in terms of civic life and an idea about the public, really, for decades now, we've been running with this idea of the public must live with austerity, right? That the private sector is going to make partnerships with the public, and that's how you're going to generate public space. And so, I sort of grew up with that, and it was funny, like in the 1990s, there were all these huge architecture projects, but really the public space was kind of lacking. And then 9/11 and Katrina and the stock market crash, and now COVID, and we're starting, it's just becoming so clear. I mean, Pratima, you mentioned inequity with the murder of George Floyd. It's so clear that we have so much inequity in our system, and public space is really the manifestation of our public values and our public life. So if we believe that the public must live with austerity, then the public is always left with the breadcrumbs of whatever the private gives. And I think we need a new narrative, not of austerity, but a narrative of generosity, where we have to understand that we have to invest in the public, invest in people, invest in public space, invest in public infrastructure that will lead to public health and better outcomes for all of us.
Right. And it seems like in making those investments, sometimes the spaces that are the most attractive to people, that people gather in, sometimes it's surprising. And so it seems like there are some secrets. I mean, one example, in New York, the Metropolitan Museum, the stairs are like a huge gathering point, and you don't think of, you think of a plaza or something, you don't necessarily think of the main gathering point being a stair to a building, or, I mean, there's so many examples of buildings that different types of seducers, as I call them, to pull people in. So what are some of your, when you think of techniques and secrets to kind of pull people into spaces and really, make them part of the public realm?
Should I answer first?
Sure.
I don't know. I think this is why you always need a good architect or a good urban design, a good designer, because in a way, this secret, how you design something that is then loved, used by the people, becoming successful, becoming a place. Well, it's not a recipe that you can write on a piece of paper. It's just every time you have to try to invent it. It's not so easy. That's why we still have the possibility to keep our profession.
And Benedetta, what are some of the more surprising kind of projects you worked on where something maybe you didn't even predict, or something that you weren't sure about but became a huge success publicly?
Well, the Santa Caterina, maybe I thank you very much. I thank you, Vishaan, to have said what you said. But at the beginning, it was really a kind of a risk, and I was so ashamed that we had painted the roof with so many colors, and I thought maybe we exaggerated a little bit. And then I was so happy that a lot of people was coming to me and saying, maybe in an airport or somewhere, and saying, oh, we love the Santa Caterina building. So this was a kind of a beautiful surprise, and colors were very well accepted, and this new public space was very well accepted, and this was a wonderful present to me, really.
That design is just incredible on the roof. Did you guys work with an artist, or was that all of your own designs on the roof there?
It's our design, but it's just taken from the photographs we took of the inside of the market. The inside of the market is fantastic, and you have this feeling that it's. I always say, you go to the market buying, and you can take away from your life a psychologist, because they really make you feel happy. You go there, you buy, you see colors, you see beautiful things, you expect what you're going to cook, and we wanted that to be on top of the roof for everybody.
Right.
So we worked with a wonderful artisan who is doing beautiful ceramic, Kumelia, but we did the design.
I love that it grew out of the market. That's something, as Vishaan, you were saying, it really grows out of the place, and people know, even if they don't know, specifically where it came from, they can feel it. And And Vishaan, you must have some good secrets on seducing people with space.
Well, I mean, I agree with Benedetta. You know, there's no one formula. Every space is very place specific, but you know, I'm reminded of when I was part of a very small group of people advocating to save the High Line in New York. And I'm sorry I didn't include a picture of it, but I think many people know it. It's this elevated old industrial rail line in New York that's been converted to public space. You know, all of the people who opposed the project and like a lot of the real estate interests who subsequently became very wealthy from the project all said, oh, you're crazy, tear it down. No one will go up there. People will get killed up there. It'll be a huge security risk because it's, you know, it's whatever it is, it's 8 meters up in the air. And, you know, it, it had 6.5 million visitors last year. It had more visitation than the Statue of Liberty. And it's all because, you know, I wasn't on the design team. It was Dilrus Renfro and James Corner Field Operations, but I helped do a lot of planning for it. And I just think that if you have a good design and it's integrated into its place and it makes sense, people will come. People are always looking for interesting and new ways to inhabit public space. You know, part of the challenge then became, you know, with some of these projects, they become so successful that they also become engines of gentrification, which is a whole other issue we can talk about, you know, some of the unintended consequences of great public space, because they tend to change land values in the market economy in which we live. And that's a whole other issue. But, you know, I do think that there's always this question of how one is place specific. So I don't think it's a sort of one set of, you know, tricks or formulas. It's just good designers looking and thinking about what will work.
Yeah, with the High Line, it's funny to look back at the people that were doubting it, including Mayor Giuliani wanted to get rid of it, and just the way that it interacts with the city, with the buildings. You're at a perspective that people hadn't gotten before, and it's just incredible. And you know, it's thinking outside the box. You know, oh, why don't we take this abandoned, you know, thing that people don't care about, and then all of a sudden people will care about it. But you're right about policy too. It has to be, you know, hand in hand with designing any of these things, because things can become more successful than you ever dreamed. They can be, you know, duds because you don't have the policy behind it. It's a huge part of it.
Yeah, and what you realize is that part of what we do in designers, and I think Benedetta's circumstances is probably a little different because she's operating in a society that has a much healthier sense of equity than we do in the United States. But the problem we have is anytime you create something nice, it immediately generates all of this gentrification because there's all this land speculation that happens. And so communities become understandably very, very suspicious whenever you design something nice in a community, because it ends up becoming something that forces that community out. And as architects and urban designers, we don't really control the political or the economic system that creates those conditions. And so that's why we have to fight on policy levels and designing policy as well as designing public space.
Yeah, you know, our policies are a little screwed up when people are afraid to have something nice in their neighborhood. That's
no. There's a lot of that in the United States.
Vishaan, you're really right, you know, and what you say, it's so terrible, no? In a way, nobody should identify good design with being suspicious that then maybe the place would be taken away from the people. No, this is a great risk. So also, I hope this will not happen. Europe, maybe it's a little easier and it's a little more used to have a city which is sharing spaces than some cities in the United States or maybe somewhere else in the world, like China, for example. No? Public spaces is something which is starting now, no? in Asia. So I think we have to fight so that people would not be suspicious about places which are well designed.
Yeah, and on the flip side is, how do we make sure, because things like the High Line are funded, you know, very well funded, but neighborhoods that don't have public spaces that are as effective, how do you make sure that they get those spaces that they need, and what kind of policy changes do we need to make to ensure that happens?
Well, that's where you have to get back to this idea of a narrative of generosity, right? Because when you have a narrative of austerity, it immediately assumes that we don't, as wealthy nations, have the ability to invest in human capital across, poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods, which is crazy. We absolutely have the capital to do that. And it just takes a certain amount of political will, as opposed to just accepting what's become this odd conventional wisdom that we don't have the money to invest in the public.
Right.
The reason we see a lot of opposition to what we call gentrification is because our cities have now become hubs of speculative capitalism. And, capital is coming into neighborhoods which were places for artists and, the workers of the city, because, and those were the beautiful hubs of our city. And I know that in capital cities of the world, you have speculative investors coming up and buying all those great places. And it's sad that, we blame the public realm and the cultural infrastructure for that. Because, in places like India, the conversation is completely different. Someone said that the sidewalk is a symbol of equality, and investing in a sidewalk is directly proportional to the quality of your democracy. And we need that because, in a city like ours, in Mumbai, 55% of people walk as their primary mode of mobility. And as you all know, we don't have sidewalks. So the narrative that both of you are talking about, the change in approach to architecture, moving away from the visual culture and moving towards creating social and community capital is so crucial, and it's an important conversation to have. And we have to say that this moment has exposed the fractures of our world more: the social disharmony, the inequality, failure of governance and leadership. The degradation of ecology has been really exposed during this pandemic, and it's a good moment to reflect and redesign our world for better. So if you were to think about policy ideas for transformation, what would that look like? What can cities do to enable the vision that both of you have outlined, for better public realm, for a more equitable neighborhood where everybody in the community has great life? What can we do to enable this vision that both of you have outlined? Benedetta, do you want to start?
I don't know. Before I talked about this fact of being included in the society you're working for. Let's say, you're working in Santa Caterina and I'm a neighbor. I think this was very, very, very important. It made it made us work with a sense of egoism, a very healthy egoism. So in a way, we have to invent ways of working where the people working on the thing has the interest to have at the end a fantastic, a successful result. I don't know how, but we have to invent that. This would be really important. Everybody involved, included.
I've really been thinking about three things relative to your question. One is obviously just more equitable public space, and I just think most major cities don't need private cars in them anymore. Part of that situation, the reason it exists in Mumbai is because even though most people don't own cars, the rich are able to take over so much of the public space of the city with their cars in a way that creates tremendous spatial inequity. And I just think most privates, I mean, it's interesting when Benedetta said, in Asia, in East Asia, they're just starting with public space. And I know what she means, but when I went to China in 1992, it had some of the most beautiful public space in the world and some of the best street sections in the world with ideas that date back, millennia. And yet the private car in one generation, in 20 years, wiped out most of that public space in favor of its exigencies and its traffic engineering needs. And so I think that's just one area where we should most cities don't need private cars. They can have freight deliveries, buses, they can have rideshare services, they can have access services for the disabled, but you just don't need private cars for most cities. So that's one place. The other two areas, I think, we're probably going to see a shrinking in office demand even after a vaccine because of remote work. I don't think office work is going to go away, but I think there's going to be some shrink in demand, which I think is an opportunity to convert some of these older office buildings into residential buildings. Pratima, I think about like the Fort District at the tip of the peninsula in Mumbai, and think, wouldn't it be amazing to take some of those old Victorian era buildings that are in the tip of Mumbai and convert them into affordable housing? And then the last thing I just think is our ground floor. I don't think retail is ever going to come back in the way we know it in our cities, and that our ground floor could be reused for a whole network of cultural and social infrastructure, of schools, of health clinics, of things that still help to activate the ground floor, instead of stupid chain stores, which no one is ever going to buy things from, near as I can tell again. And so I just think there's a lot of ways we can think about the city post-COVID that could be a much more equitable, generous place.
That's, I think you read my mind, because that was my next question was about how COVID is going to play a role. COVID and other disruptive factors play a role in these changes. Because as you said, as you were saying, Vishaan, it's certainly disrupting retail, it's disrupting office, it's and then there's other changes. Automated cars are going to change things too. Parking, maybe you won't have individual car ownership. So it's sort of rethinking the public realm, again, not just in a classic civic square, but you could have the public realm be on storefronts. You could have the public realm be in a former mall. You could have public realm be in somewhere else that has been disrupted. With climate change, you're going to have to build new public realm to protect from floods. So it's sort of, there's all these incredible opportunities to build the public realm, but it's a decision of what our priorities are going to be.
Yeah, and we have to be careful about not getting enamored with technology, because we did that once after the invention of the car, and we changed our entire urban landscape, right? And so when people get all excited about things like automated cars, automated cars could be a nightmare for our cities if we're not careful. And so we have to have an agenda where we place people first, and then, the technologists have to realize that their inventions and the needs of their inventions are at the service of humanity, not the other way around.
Right. And when we talk about opportunities like climate change, it seems like right now there's a huge opportunity. We're putting all the stimulus because of COVID. It seems like you could have these places coming together. Instead of spending money on the usual things, maybe spend money to jumpstart our economy by putting in place more green infrastructure, or infrastructure that is green but also incorporates public space. It seems like there's just so many opportunities now that it's sort of hard to keep track of it all.
For sure. I think in a way, whenever I listen to COVID or climate change being an opportunity, I get a little mad, because they are not fantastic themes, especially COVID. I don't want to give COVID any credit to being the impulsor of something good.
Well, I see what you're saying.
Forgotten, but it was good to create a consciousness, maybe a consciousness of something which was already needed, which was already going on, which was already on the tables of the architects and urban planners, but now we are so clear that it's so important. So maybe public space, it was fantastic, no, when Vishaan was talking before about the small scale and the big scale, the village scale and the urban metropolis scale of the public space. I think we have to go in different scales and be very clear that we should create a public space for the, maybe for the flats, then for the neighborhood, for the city, for the houses. For example, here in Barcelona, all the houses has a flat roof. It was fantastic. All the neighbors could make agreements of how to use the flat roof, and it was one of the most fantastic public spaces we could use. And then in the neighborhood, you have another level of public space. And then in the city, you have symbolic public spaces. So I think going on different scales, it's a very, very important thing. And it's also making everything more inclusive.
Right. And Benedetta, I want to say, we don't want to give COVID any credit. That's a good point.
No.
We do want to, the way I see it is we want to see it as a silver lining. Otherwise, it's just bad. And I always like to see the positive. And otherwise, it's like, well, COVID just is this horrible thing. But, you know, any horrible thing, there's a silver lining. And I think we need to take advantage of that. It does magnify all these problems. And it does open up, you know, opportunities in a way that, you know, we don't do on our own. But I also, Benedetta, wanted to ask you about so many of your projects that you showed, especially a lot of those renderings that you were showing later, really incorporate green space as a way to become a public space and to attract people. And that seems to be something that there's more openness to putting green space in buildings or along the sides of buildings or outside of buildings. So maybe you can talk about the importance of that as far as, because I know there's some cities like Singapore that are even, you know, forcing, you know, developers to put green space along their buildings or in their buildings. Like, is this sort of the future?
I think it's very important for the future. In a way, we to this idea of including, you know, of not saying here is the city, here is the outside of the city, here is the countryside, here. No, it's including what we need, and we need this kind of natural life. We need this vegetation. We also need to live with materials which are kind of real. No, in a way, the wood is something which is alive, even if it's a table or it's a floor or if it's something in your house. It's always alive, and also it's very sustainable because you have this possibility to use the wood of a tree and replant the tree. So in the same time you're using this material is growing again. So I think this is very important. This is also giving a kind of a happiness, no? You don't know why, but maybe because you have this feeling. All this presence of vegetation, natural materials give you a good feeling.
Yeah, it's as Vishaan was saying, we get enamored with technology, but then we often go back to the basics, and those are what really can count. Sort of balancing those two things. And we have I wanted to show a brief slideshow of my own. I'd like to show. I kind of thought to myself, what are the different types of public spaces that we have? So I'm going to do a really quick tour, and I'm going to have to set it up. So Pratima, give me a second here. You can.
You know, I just wanted.
Oops.
Oh, we lost her.
We lost Pratima.
I
got her. I got her.
Just a brief internet outage, but I just want to, take a moment to highlight the points that both of you made, which is, Benedetta, the way you described the, life in an architectural, in built environment with access to nature and community life. That's amazing. And Vishaan, the scale of the city and reimagining it from a community life perspective, considering we're at a time when retail could potentially, go away for a substantial amount of time post this crisis. So I think those two were really amazing points that kind of brought to life this vision for
Well, I mean, I know Sam has this slideshow. I just wanted to quickly point out that, you know, there's a long history of our built environment changing in response to pandemics. The plague, cholera, tuberculosis set up a lot of our modern light and air standards. And so there's some debate about saying these things are opportunities or silver linings, but there's a natural outcome and progression that humankind has when confronted with the kinds of crises like the medical and public health crisis that we're in. And so I just think it's important to say, well, whether you want to call it an opportunity or a silver lining or a result or whatever you want to call it, there's just a natural trajectory that comes from a big global event like this that's affected cities in the past and will affect cities in the future.
And you never let a good crisis go to waste. So it's a good time to actualize all the visions that both of you have outlined and push it forward.
Yeah, and it is important to stress this is a horrible event, and we can't understress that enough. But yeah, I think we're pretty resilient creatures for all our problems. So it's pretty impressive to see what people are coming up with in response. So is this working? Yes. Oh, okay, great. So this is the quickest tour ever of different types of civic spaces. And it starts back from the beginning of Western civilization. As Benedetta and Vishaan were saying, there's a lot more besides Western civilization. But the Parthenon is really where it begins for the West, and that's a public space revolving around, as you can see, the Acropolis, I should say. The Parthenon is the temple in the center, but there's a series of temples and public spaces around them. And the Agora at the base of the hill is a public market. And you can see people proceeding into that. And then you have the Forum in Rome, of course, a series of public markets around temples, quite popular, as you can see. Wow. Then you have public spaces around churches, of course. This is St. Mark's Square in Venice. And obviously this is the Vatican. Barmini's amazing public space around another church, St. Paul's. And of course, in Mexico City, the cathedral and the palace being the centerpiece of the plaza there. Then you have Place des Vosges in Paris, the first park to be public space to be built around and specifically built around housing, around very nice housing, but around housing. And then the boulevards in Paris, which are public space as roads, and Vishaan, you were mentioning a little bit about that, built in conjunction with new housing and new buildings, and the opera there at the end being the focal point. Rockefeller Center, then you have civic space and shopping, one of the first models of that, an incredible model, shopping and offices. Then you have in New York more civic spaces like Bryant Park around libraries, the New York Public Library. I mentioned before, the stairs is civic space at the Met. And then at Lincoln Center, civic space around culture. And then the High Line, as we talked about, civic space really, I think the most important part about that is revolving around buildings and around the sort of new view of the architecture in the city. And then you have buildings as civic space. This is the Oslo Opera House in Norway by Snøhetta. You have buildings like Bilbao, Guggenheim in Bilbao, which has an incredible public space built into it. And Bilbao had an incredible public space plan woven in and out of this. And I think it's a much better example of a civic building than Frank Gehry's other kind of titanium giant building at the time, which was Disney Hall, which I don't think is a civic building, much of a civic building at all, in my opinion, because of it doesn't really correspond with the street quite as well. The garden in the back, which you have to walk up steps, is fantastic, but it's not, I don't consider it as civic. In Paris, you have Les Halles, the rethinking of Les Halles, so building a civic space, rebuilding a civic space along with retail. That was a horrible civic space for a long time, but now it's becoming something quite beautiful again. In Miami, you have Lincoln Road, using canopies and greenery to enliven a shopping promenade and make that into a civic space. You have civic space in LA. This is the Lucas Museum that's coming up. There you have green space. It's lifted up, so you have green space underneath it in civic space, and then you have a green building, a green park on top of it. So civic space everywhere. A civic space in San Francisco at the Transbay or Salesforce building, you have a park on top of a building. Really innovative ways to do it. And then in LA, you have a civic space on a bridge, the 6th Street Bridge, in which you have parks under it. You have walking spaces and bike spaces on it. So rethinking, and this is happening more often, rethinking what a public space can be. So that's my really fast tour of civic space possibilities, both in history and now. So maybe with that, we can go into another segment which we call quick fire, and ask you some quick questions about civic space and other things. Pratima, you want to go first?
Yes. So my first question to both of you is, which is your favorite public space and why, in a sentence? Benedetta?
This is so difficult, but I think in a way my favorite public space is the sea and space in front of the seaside. It's fantastic, no? Maybe it was not considered until now, but it is.
And Benedetta, in Barcelona, you're lucky that you have the sea. That the sea is a public space that interacts with the city. It's not away from the city.
And this is very, very new. You know, the city needed centuries to understand that this presence of the sea was a very important possibility for public space. It was totally closed and not looking at the sea.
When was that? When did they finally open it up like that?
It started with the Olympics, and it's still going on. So it's very recent, 92.
Early 90s.
Yes.
Amazing.
And it's amazing to see the images of Barcelona pre that era and now. What a dramatic transformation, and a great example of the city that we all need, investing into people-centric infrastructure.
It's a great example because it was not so charming, it was not so full of public spaces before, and it got transformed into an example of that. So it means that every city can go through this transformation. Yeah,
and if you have amazing beaches, or if you have public spaces that are closed off from cities by highways or by other things, it sort of chokes them. But if you can connect the buildings and the public space, then they both benefit.
Of course.
Vishaan, what about you? Favorite public space and why?
Wow, it's a tough question. You know, I was born in Calcutta, and an Indian admiral once told me that Calcutta was the shame and the glory of mankind. And you know, and this is going to sound like a weird translation, but I then translate that to my life as a New Yorker. And I think my favorite public space, at least in the New York context or that kind of context, is Union Square, because it's also the sort of shame and the glory of mankind, in the sense that, like, Union Square is a mess in many ways, but it also, you know, all of these subway lines intersect there. There's everything from playgrounds to drug dealers to Hare Krishnas. The hardscape on the north part of Union Square is a farmer's market. It's a staging ground for protests. It's skateboarders. Both my office and my apartment in New York are right near it. And there's something about it. I mean, I think about it after 9/11. It has, you know, I think a great public space has the capacity to transform from the sort of daily life of the city to those moments. I mean, I remember after 9/11, you know, where Union Square was the kind of dividing line for being able to go further into Lower Manhattan and near the World Trade Center site. And there were all of these tributes, and people had posters up. They had missing friends and relatives, and it was very solemn. And yet it's still the place where a person can take their child to go play, or an old person can have their lunch. And, you know, that multivalence, that capacity, is, I think, one of the things that I look for in a public space, when it can do many different things in response to what the public demands of it at a given time.
Yeah, things that we don't even think about. As I'm in Union Square a lot, and, you know, I couldn't name everything that you're thinking of. It's much more layered than we ever think.
Yeah.
That's great. And so I have another question. We like putting you guys on the spot. Apologies in advance. But what is the most memorable thing you've done in a public space? It could be getting married. It could be protesting. It could be whatever. Can you think of that?
I think Benedetta and I have the same thought, which is this is a PG-rated program, right?
My God. I don't know. Something fantastic in a public space. So many things have been happening in the public space. Yes, actually, you mentioned getting married. Actually, I got married in a public space in Barcelona, which was only 40 years ago, a block of houses. And it was actually housing the flat of Picasso when he was living in Barcelona. So I think it was fantastic to be so courageous to take away that block, create a piazza there, and then it became a fantastic piazza for weddings. So I could get wedding on top of Pablo Picasso flat.
Wow, that's pretty classy.
Isn't it?
And a great story.
It's the first time I say it. I didn't remember that.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So Vishaan, PG here.
It's dancing on 13th Street between Avenue A and B in 1988. I was fresh out of college, and I remember, the city was different then. Like, a street party was just like two people just decided to close off the street with some barrels or an old car or something, and they weren't selling tube socks and bad meat. Like, it's very different than the street fairs that we have now. And I remember, like, people were just like, it was hot and people were playing music and dancing on the street. And then two dancers who worked for, I think there were a couple that worked for the New York City Ballet, just decided to put an impromptu performance on in the street. And it was incredible. Like, it was so spontaneous and natural and kind of and equitable in the sense that it belonged to everyone. And that idea of the street as the most basic building block for our city's public realm, I think, was something that was really reinforced in my head that day.
That's wonderful. I love being reminded of that. I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and recently I took a bike ride I got tacos in Bushwick. Took a bike ride back, and it was a really hot day. And so a lot of people had taken the fire hydrants and opened them up. So I rode through three fire hydrant sprays as I was going along. I came back, I was totally drenched, and it was wonderful. It was one of the best bike rides ever. It's just like you feel so kind of, it's like this is a great city. It's like every square inch of it can be used as a public space.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing those stories. It just demonstrates how public space is where life happens and where we make memories happen. So thank you for those candid stories and for indulging us. My next question, brownfield or greenfield development? Benedetta?
What does it mean, brownfield? I'm ignorant.
Is this like American or English lingo? Brownfield is building in an existing city versus building in an open kind of tabula rasa kind of site where nothing else happened, right? Like an open site versus building in the city.
I'm afraid about emptiness. So in a way, I always realize that there's something. No, even if you think you're acting somewhere where there's nothing, there's always something in the earth, something underneath, some history. So I like to relate to things.
So dense city or outskirts? Maybe that's a more appropriate way to describe that.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. You like to relate to things, and yeah. It also gives you inspiration versus having to start from scratch. There's a big advantage to that.
Yes, it's really helping.
Vishaan?
I'm the same way. I mean, I don't really believe there's such a thing as a greenfield site. There is no tabula rasa. There is ecology, there's climate, there's local culture. but I think I always prefer to work in places that push back at me, right? Where it's not just drawing on a blank piece of paper, but like, so for instance, you know, like all of these projects that people do, you know, where like in parts of the Arabian Peninsula where it's just some empty site in the sand and someone asks you to just design an icon. I have no interest in that whatsoever. And to me, the more people and places, whether it's communities, democratic process, context, climate, materiality, light, whatever it is that pushes back at me, the more I feel like I have with my team kind of food with which to kind of make a meal and think about how to design something. I don't know how to do it in a vacuum.
I love that metaphor. It's like you've got all the food, all the ingredients there, rather than trying to make something, you know.
Yeah, from something from nothing, because you can't make a very good meal with no ingredients.
So I'm gonna skip to the last question because for time's sake, and this is one that I'm gonna participate in. You guys all have pencils and paper. Great. So, and I'm gonna. I must admit, I knew what this was in advance, so I have an advantage. But I'm a horrible drawer, so it's even. So, draw a public space that can seduce people.
It can be very quick. It's more about ideas.
Yeah. We don't have to be. We don't need to
And I want to take a moment to say hello to the community that has stayed with us for almost an hour. Do let us know if you have any questions for our speaker, and we'll make sure to ask them. And yeah, thanks again for joining us during this important conversation. Please hit the subscribe button if you're on YouTube, or use the like button on our Facebook pages. And I hope you can continue to join us and stay in touch. And I think this is, this has been such an important conversation, because over the last couple of decades, you've actually had an architectural culture very much focused on the visual culture of architecture. And we have had this huge culture of architecture. So it's nice to kind of talk about the social impact and the cultural value of built environment. So yeah, thanks for this important conversation. So let us know if you have any questions. I think they're just almost done with their sketches. Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'm...
Vishaan, should. Are you done? Vishaan, do you want to start?
It's just a street.
Wow. Okay.
It's just a street. It's great public space. You dance in it. There's subways running underneath it. It's just a street. It's not so hard. Like, it's just one of the most basic building blocks of mankind.
But it's a place that you realize when people do like gated communities or something, you realize the energy that you lose when you don't have that basic block. And that basic block, the reason it's so effective is it's not just a street, it's not just a way to get around from point A to point B, but it's that in between. It's people walking along it. There's so much to it.
Well, I'm always amazed when I have very good friends who love designing object buildings, and then you've got a street grid and an object building, and what they do is they fill the in-between space in with some shrubbery, like from Monty Python. And it's like,
but there's a saying which says that, creating good streets should be common sense, but common sense is not that common. And, it's demonstrated across contemporary city life everywhere. We've forgotten to build, just streets, which are probably the soul of urban life. So thanks for reminding us about that, Vishaan. Benedetta?
Oh, yeah, how do I show the build?
We can see you.
I did this drawing, which is writing and things on it. It's a public space which is lovely, inclusive, is green, is happy, and is colorful, and much more things. So more or less.
Love it.
The moon was there, the sun was there, some flowers were there.
So it's public space. It's art. It's poetry. It's everything. I like it. You guys have to keep these for us, or take a scan of them. We're trying to collect all of these. This is great.
Okay.
All right. So mine is of a much worse drawing, but so this is drawing from the idea of a street, a driving roundabout, but it's a pedestrian roundabout. And in the middle is art, so it's drawing everybody towards the middle. So it's a pedestrian seducer, and that's my drawing.
Fantastic! Now you have to develop it.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being a sport and sharing your ideas for future of public realm. Do we have time for an audience question, Sam?
Yeah, let's do a couple of questions.
So we have a question from Shruti Dior, who is asking us, how do we respond to reclaiming streets as a public space for the homeless or even those that live temporarily on the streets and sidewalks?
Yeah, and Vishaan, I know in the Bay Area, that's a huge question.
In the Bay Area, it's a huge question. Well, we have a whole other set of homeless issues in California. But just on that Not Your Car project, we actually consulted with a major community homeless group. And we actually thought about creating, like, if you eliminated cars, could you create temporary shelter space in the street? And what they really advised us is, rather than creating temporary spaces in the street, that to create small buildings that could actually accommodate homeless social services, showers, internet, just the ability to get certain kinds of social support services. And so we actually integrated that into some of the work that we proposed.
Interesting. And how did it sort of, how did it play out, and what were people responsive to that idea?
People are, what I find, Sam, and this as being a member of the Fourth Estate, that a lot of people struggle with reading beyond a headline. And so it's hard sometimes it's hard for people to actually digest all that. So I'm hoping over time they will.
Yeah, I mean, I know everywhere in the US it's a problem, but California is really being hit hard by homelessness, and I feel like they're part of the public realm, and it's a reflection on all of us. But if we can think of ways to incorporate people living there, if we can think of ways to house them, it's going to bring up. I talk about silver linings, and it's horrible to have homelessness, but first of all, we need to stop homelessness. But also, just thinking of creative solutions, I think you can improve the public realm in addition to helping the homeless.
I think it's a question which is not only for architects, no? It's for the complete society.
No, and that's a good point. I mean, I think a lot of times we like to think we can solve all the issues as designers, and there needs to be coordination. You can't just solve it as a designer. You have to come up with good designs that then interact with public policy and have good ideas for public policy. Otherwise, they're not going to happen.
So that project I showed in East New York, that's 100% affordable housing. One of the buildings is meant as transitional supportive housing for formerly homeless women. And I think we're still in the approval stage, so we haven't gotten to the point where we're going to actually speak to potential users. And I think that's really critical. But we already know certain things about the dimensions, like the building shouldn't be too big. And the most important thing is that it have support services, not just housing. But so for instance, that building will probably have 24/7 daycare, because a lot of single parents work night shifts and so forth. And it's those things that start generating homelessness, because they don't have the proper support services.
Right.
Lorena asks, there are arguments that streets in cities are busy and polluted. How do we argue against that as urban designers and urbanites?
Well, in a way, what Vishaan was explaining until now, this trying to make a city which is less used by cars, which is more open. It could be a kind of a step towards a healthier city. In a way, I think here in Barcelona things are happening, and a lot of people moves more with bicycles and with also walking. I think it's very important because also you are making the city a kind of a gym. You are not only not using a car and making it less polluted, but also kind of moving your body and maintain yourself in a kind of a good shape.
Yeah, Benedetta, some of your projects, like at Scottish Parliament, just the shape of the earth, like you can really kind of impact the way people move through those spaces, and if they want to exercise, or if they, however they. It seems like you guys are interested in that sort of not just making public space, but having it shape people's interaction with it.
Yeah, we love this, and when this happens, it's fantastic. I think in a way that space in front of the Scottish Parliament was not existed. It was a field which was privately owned by the Queen, and so now it exists. And when the good spaces exist, people moves in them. They need time to discover, and then it's fantastic when people discover how to use it.
I just wanted to quickly say to the last question that it's really problematic. Our streets are polluted. It's great that they're busy. And so I think it's just a question, what are they busy with? And we want them to be busy with people, not cars.
Right. And obviously, doesn't mean we don't want to have street cleaning, and it doesn't mean like after midnight maybe people should be quiet, but most of the time activity is good, and it's safer too.
Right.
There's also a question here. It's a long question, so I'm worried it's going to take up the whole screen, but essentially it's this concern that a lot of spaces now that are kind of pseudo-public, they're sort of under the guise of being public, but they're actually privately owned public spaces, owned by corporations, an office that owns the space, or a mall that owns the space. So then it becomes a question of what exactly defines a public space, and what are the levels of that?
I don't know. There's in a way also when a space is owned by the city, or the city is behind it, I think it's really kind of the collectivity is behind. So in a way, it depends very much on the political structure of each one of the places, and that the collective should be in charge of most of them. So that's why participate is so important.
Vishaan?
Well, I mean, it depends on, I agree with Benedetta, it depends on the culture and the context. In America, that question is a very different question than in India or in Europe. The Domino Park is privately owned, and I think it actually feels more public than a lot of the public parks in New York City.
I can attest to that. It really does.
And actually has less regulation around it than a lot of the public parks. But generally, I mean, like the open space at Hudson Yards is private space, and I think it's really not great private space. A lot of the spaces that I've been to that are private are not great. So I think it just depends. I don't think it's just a knee-jerk political response. I think you have to look at the details.
Right. And I wonder, I mean, when it becomes private, you said it depends, but I guess there's ways to force it to be better. Otherwise, you won't give them zone approval.
And New York has very stringent laws on privately owned public space. And the policy around incentive zoning to push private sector to deliver urban commons is a good way to create the urban commons. But I think the rules around how it is run is important,
Right.
and how it is managed and who's allowed, and the governance should be by the the city authorities and local government. But there's nothing wrong with private sector supporting the agenda of creating public realm.
Right. It's just how is it done? I agree with that.
Yeah.
Benedetta, we've had a couple of questions about your ceiling, so we have to ask you.
Yeah, everybody loves the ceiling, Benedetta.
You said you hadn't even noticed it before, right?
Not so much. We didn't give it so much importance, but we are in an old building in the old city of Barcelona, and only 30 years ago, this was considered kind of the worst part of the city. So this building, this space, we got it, and it was the ceiling was totally invisible because it was a second floor flying in the middle. So when we took away the second floor, this ceiling came out. We
Amazing.
thought it was too luxurious, so we wanted to have some white stripes go on top, but at the end we never did them.
Kind of reminds me when you said that they removed the barrier to the beach that was put in, and then you have this amazing result. It's just like getting rid of these kind of barriers that I never quite understood why they were there in the first place. But
I think we should take one last question and end this, because I know both of you have meetings to go to. But in low income, we have a question from Spady. In low income cities where informal activities prevail and the public space is at the core of the urban economy, and operators often compete with each other and struggle for this space, how far can public space in such cities be a response to social fragmentation and exclusion? In emerging world cities where there are a ton of informal activities, where everybody's fighting for that little space, how can public space be a tool for inclusion? I think that's a better way of putting this question forward.
I think we are now kind of talking in general, but of course there are very different ways of having the public space. As far as I understand, this public space which is described in the question is a public space where kind of economic informal activities are taking place. So I don't know, this for sure the authorities have to organize, and it must be a kind of equal organization. And I just had in mind the activity of selling in a market many centuries ago in this city. It was in the street, and for sure it was kind of not so organized. And now the city of Barcelona, for example, have more than 60 markets, closed roofed markets, and everything is very regulated. So I think little by little, this from life, the regularization comes.
And I remember the market in the where the ancient flea market artisans were given this great architecture for for continuing their trade, and they've been around for centuries. And you're right, in India, the streets and public realm were always about commerce, culture, and community life. Yeah. It was not about cars like it's been in contemporary cities. Yeah. Vishaan?
Well, just to add to that, there was a famous mayor of Bogota who said, a great city isn't a city where poor people have cars, it's where rich people ride mass transit. And, I remember when the metro first opened in Calcutta, and suddenly you did start seeing more class interaction and so forth, because the car is a natural segregator. And as you say, when I think of the older small cities I've been to in India that were pre-car, there was this idea that there was the street that everyone walked on, and there was usually these stone plinths, and that, you know, whether you were a tailor or a vendor, you could operate from your plinth. And there was just much more of a sense of equanimity in those cities, and the car destroyed all of that.
Yeah, it's incredible. That's an incredible point. The fact that we're saying, I couldn't think of a better argument for making more spaces civic, because it's like in places like LA where I lived for a long time and people are in cars, there seems to be less trust between different classes and different people. There is a subway in LA, but it's very segregated.
There's a whole movie about it called Crash.
Yeah, and I love LA, but that is an issue there. And then civic spaces, what they do is like the subway. They get people of all classes together. You start to realize that it's not something really to be scared of, and people start to, you know, really understand each other. You don't have the polarization, and it's something. I mean, obviously, we need more now than we ever have, particularly in our country, but I think everywhere. And it's something that I think people don't realize how important it is to just interact with other people. Just how simply, you know, important that for your mental health, but also for the health of the whole society. So I think that's a great way to end it. And we just really appreciate Vishaan and Benedetta, your time and your amazing insights. We appreciate everybody who's been on this webcast for the last hour and a half, and everybody with all their great questions. And Pratima, did you want to say a closing word?
No, I think thank you for such an important conversation, Benedetta and Vishaan. And I hope we all can meet somewhere nice and have a real conversation about this agenda and how to kind of move it forward. Thank you for doing this and spending this hour with us.
Someday we'll all meet in a public space together.
Yes.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to be with you. Really fantastic. And this is a sort of public space.
That's
It's
true.
limited.
It's the new public space. Yes,
It's true.
And thanks to Arc Daily as well for being our media sponsor. We want to really appreciate their partnership. And we look forward to more discussion soon. We'll be talking about our next conversation. A couple of them one will be about the future of schools, which is an important issue, obviously, right now. And we'll also be talking about equity in architecture and urban design. So, and we have a lot more coming up. So please stay tuned for those. And thanks again.
And finally, thank you to the amazing audience that stayed through this
Yeah.
conversation for 1.5 hours. Thank you, guys, and have a great day or evening. And we hope to see you soon as we share more ideas for disruption in design and built environment. Thank you.
Thanks again.